Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are looking at, well, perhaps the most expansive question facing our species. And it's one that has suddenly crashed from the pages of sci-fi novels right into our political reality. Are we defined by the soil beneath our feet or the stars above our heads? It is the tension between the immediate necessity of terrestrial stability and the infinite allure of celestial ambition.
And crashed is exactly the right word. We saw this, quite clearly on January 20th, 2025. In President Trump's inauguration speech, he didn't just mention space. He explicitly invoked the phrase manifest destiny regarding the launch of American astronauts to Mars. He framed it as a national imperative, a kind of spiritual mandate. It wasn't about science, it was about conquest.
Exactly. And that rhetoric, it really forces us to confront a massive question. Is this push for a multi-planetary civilization the next necessary step in our anthropological evolution? A spiritual destiny, really? Or, as I think you might argue, is it a dangerous distraction from the very real structural fragilities threatening to, collapse our civilization from within?
I would say it's more than a distraction, it's a delusion. Because when you look at the health of a political community, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle, it doesn't depend on how far its rockets go or how big its monuments are. It depends on the security of its middle class. And right now, that foundation is cracking. You can't launch a rocket from a swamp, and economically speaking, that is what we are standing on.
You say it's a delusion, but I'd argue that staying here is the delusion. The idea that we can just fix Earth and then maybe later think about the stars. I think that's a trap. I want to start with a concept from the analyst Marko Jukic. He describes this vivid experience of standing on a boat on the Nile, looking up at the night sky, and seeing the planets aligned. And in that moment, the world stops being just the dirt in the atmosphere. You realize that our natural habitat actually requires the sun, the moon, the stabilizing gravity of the solar system. To draw a border at the atmosphere is just a convention, not a reality.
It's a beautiful image, standing on the Nile, contemplating the cosmos. Sure. But while Jukic is looking at the stars, I'm looking at the people on the banks of that river. If we aren't solely a terrestrial species, we are certainly a material one. We eat, we sleep, we require shelter. And the system providing that is, well, it's failing.
But Jukic's point is that we cannot answer the question, what are we, through philosophy alone. We have to go there. This drive, it isn't just economic or military. If you look at the history of rocketry, people like Konstantin Tsiolkovsky or Hermann Oberth, they weren't trying to build weapons initially. They were mystics.
Mystics? They were engineers.
They were both. Think about Tsiolkovsky. He isn't just crunching numbers for propulsion. When he derived the rocket equation, he viewed it as a form of liberation theology. He believed that gravity literally compresses the human spirit, binding us to our animal nature. He thought that by escaping Earth's gravity physically, we would evolve ethically. It wasn't just about going higher, it was about becoming better. To him, the enigma of the universe could only be solved if we stopped being, heavy.
That is a fascinating intellectual history. I'll grant you that. But let's ground this for a moment. You talk about escaping gravity to become better, but in the real world, space programs are funded by taxes and capital generated by labor. I'm looking at the data from Nancy Birdsall regarding the global middle class. She draws a hard line at $10 a day. Now that sounds low to a Western listener, but globally, that is the security threshold.
Explain why that specific number matters. Why $10?
Because below that $10 line, you aren't a citizen in the political sense. You are purely in survival mode. You are what Birdsall calls a struggler, earning between $4 and $10 a day. These people aren't destitute, they aren't starving, but they are one shock away from poverty. A lost job, a sick child, a bad harvest, and they fall right back into the hole. And when that group grows, you don't get stability, you get populism. You get the protests we saw in Brazil over bus fares or the Arab Spring, which started because a vegetable seller had his cart confiscated. These are people living on the absolute edge. You cannot build a starship on a foundation of strugglers.
But you're assuming that the strugglers need to be secure before a civilization can do great things. History suggests otherwise. I rely on the demographics of destiny analysis here. It posits that while the poor and the middle class provide the continuity of civilization, the biological bedrock, it is the rich, the visionaries, who determine the direction of civilization. Throughout history, high culture projects, whether they are cathedrals or space programs, are driven by capital investment and the singular vision of a few. Elon Musk is the modern archetype of this. He is shaping the direction, even if the demographic continuity comes from elsewhere.
But does he have the right to shape that direction if it ignores the material reality of the majority? That's the tension. We are seeing a clash between a technological utopia and traditional wisdom. Brandon Barthrop critiques this Muskian worldview very sharply. He points out that Musk cites Isaac Asimov's Foundation series as his inspiration. Well, that's a vision of a purely technological, human-centric future where math solves history. Barthrop and traditionalists like Harry Oldmeadow would argue that this is a false prophet of modernism. It's an idol. It ignores the divine order and tries to create a new one based on silicon and rocket fuel.
I think that's a misreading of what the space program actually represents to its true believers. You call it a false prophet, but to them, it is the divine order. Wernher von Braun, who built the Saturn V, was deeply religious. He saw space travel as a divine urge. He used his old-fashioned term germplasm, but he effectively meant the seeds of life. He saw Earth as a pod about to burst, and space travel as the wind carrying those seeds to new soil. To him, slamming the door in space was slamming the door in God's face. This isn't a rejection of the sacred, it's an expansion of it. It's a new manifest destiny, as Peggy Reeder describes. It functions as a sociological engine. It unifies us.
Or it distracts us. Let's talk about that term, manifest destiny, for a second. That phrase has a lot of blood on it. Reeder reminds us that this concept was used to justify the erasure of indigenous cultures in the American West. It framed the land as empty, just waiting for the civilized man to arrive.
And space is empty. There are no indigenous Martians to displace.
That we know of. But the mindset is the same. Reeder contrasts this with the indigenous idea of sky country, that the earth and sky are connected, not a frontier to be conquered. When we treat space as a resource to be mined or a colony to be settled, we are bringing a colonial mindset to the cosmos. We treat space like the Wild West, a place to stick a flag. But indigenous cultures look at the sky and see a ceiling, not a door. They see it as part of the home we are already in. We are trying to conquer the living room.
I understand the hesitation with the colonial metaphor, but let's look at the economics, because you keep coming back to the cost. There is a common argument, Jukic brings this up, that we should go to space to mine asteroids like 16 Psyche. They say it has quintillions of dollars of nickel. But Jukic actually argues that's a weak justification.
Right, because if you bring that much nickel back, the price of nickel crashes to zero. The economics just don't work.
Exactly. We have plenty of resources on Earth. We don't need space for the money. We need it for legitimacy. States need legitimacy projects. Ancient China had the bronze ding vessels. Medieval Europe had cathedrals. A civilization that stops building cathedrals eventually dies of spiritual atrophy. Space is the only project large enough to legitimize a modern global civilization. If we stop doing the hard thing, we stop believing in ourselves.
Legitimacy through monuments. Okay, let's look at the ultimate example of that, ancient Rome. That is the cautionary tale you are ignoring. Rome was the master of building monuments to its own glory while its people rotted. We have sources describing the poverty in Rome, people living in taberna, the damp vaults beneath the theaters, or in insula, these dangerous, rickety apartment buildings that were absolute fire traps. They would collapse or burn down constantly.
Rome lasted 1,000 years. It must have done something right.
It lasted by using bread and circuses to distract the mob. The grain dole, the cura annona, kept them fed, and the games kept them distracted. My fear is that a Mars colony is just a high-tech circus. The social structure of Rome was divided into the honestioras, the rich, the honorable, and the humilioras, the lowly. And the law literally treated them differently. If you were a humilior, you could be tortured. If you were an honestior, you couldn't.
And you see that parallel today?
Absolutely. If the middle class isn't big enough to demand accountability, as Birdsall warns, The state becomes a vehicle for the vanity of the rich. You have Musk and the state projecting power into space, the new honestioras, while down here, the strugglers represent the humilioras. They are rioting because they can't afford the commute to work, while the elite are building rockets. That is not a stable launch pad. It's a powder keg.
I think you are underestimating the power of the frontier to solve those very problems. You call it a circus, I call it a pressure valve. Jukic points out that without an open frontier, humanity feels irrelevant. This leads to dangerous ideologies like degrowth, the idea that we should shrink, retreat, and make ourselves smaller. That is a path to stagnation. Tsiolkovsky said, Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in the cradle forever. If we stay in the cradle, we don't just stop growing, we start fighting over the toys. The rich visionaries you criticize, they are the ones breaking the ceiling so we don't suffocate.
But breaking the ceiling doesn't help if the floor is falling out. I come at it from a different way. You say degrowth is dangerous, but Old Meadow and the traditionalists would say that progress is the real myth. We have this evolutionist idea that we are constantly getting better just because our machines are faster. But look at the 20th century, the bloodiest in history. We have technological advancement without wisdom. The Demographics of Destiny source explicitly states that civilization needs wisdom, often found in religious traditions, to sustain birth rates and social cohesion. Purely secular, technological societies stop having children. They fragment. If we export a Muskian, high-tech culture to Mars, we are just exporting a dying culture. We are exporting collapse.
That's a heavy charge. But have you considered that the act of going to space might be the source of new wisdom? Jukic argues that the space age effectively ended in 1972 because we lost the sense of mystery. We found no canals on Mars, no aliens. But he argues we need to physically survey the stars to resolve our existential angst. It's the Fermi paradox. Where is everyone? The silence is deafening. Jukic is terrified of that silence. He looks at the stars and sees a graveyard. That fear is what drives the rocket, not economics. We need to go there to find out if we are truly alone. That knowledge would transform our philosophy, our religion, our governance.
Or it would just be another data point we ignore while our cities crumble. You talk about governance, but let's be real about who is going to run this show. You called it a legitimacy project for the state, but Jukic also notes that governments are terrible at this. They only go to space for geopolitical reasons, the Cold War, or now the rivalry with China. Once the threat fades, the funding stops. Democracies operate on 4-year election cycles. You can't plan a 100-year terraforming project when you're worried about polling numbers in Pennsylvania next November.
Exactly. That is why the rich are necessary. The great filter of governance stops us. Governments are driven by temporary fears. Jukic argues we need a civilization-level shift where space is the central project. This requires the kind of capital and singular vision that only a tycoon or a dynasty can provide. The rich contribute the capital investment and the innovation. We cannot wait for a consensus from a committee. If we wait for the government to fix the middle class before we leave, we will never leave.
But that brings us right back to the danger of the honestiorius. If the project is driven by the ultra-wealthy because democracy is too slow, then the result will serve the ultra-wealthy. In Rome, the legal distinction between the rich and poor became the only law that mattered. If we rely on billionaires to be our saviors, we are entering a new feudalism. And let's remember the strugglers. Birdsall's data shows that when the middle class is small, it aligns with the rich, not the poor. It becomes dependent on the state or the elite. That is not a free society. That is a client state. You can't have a free, multiplanetary civilization if the people building it are essentially serfs working for a company store on Mars.
I see the risk of feudalism, but look at the alternative. The Demographics of Destiny points out that while the poor provide continuity, they do not drive innovation. If we focus entirely on redistribution and stability, we stagnate, and stagnation is fatal. Civilizations that stop expanding stop living. We are already a spacefaring animal. The Earth is not a closed system. We are dependent on the sun and moon. To deny our cosmic nature is to deny reality. We need to embrace the manifest destiny, not as a conquest, but as a maturation.
Maturation. That implies we're growing up.
But I argue that leaving your room messy to go play outside isn't growing up, it's avoidance. Barthrop argues we're creating an idol of progress. We are trying to build the New Jerusalem with rockets. But the New Jerusalem is a spiritual restoration, not a colony on Mars. It's about justice. It's about how we treat the least of these.
But isn't it possible that the New Jerusalem requires a new heaven and a new earth? I'm not convinced by the idea that we must solve every spiritual and social problem here before we leave. That's a trap. We will never solve every problem. Tsiolkovsky knew this. He was an atheist, yet he saw the cosmos as a way to social perfection. He believed we were marionettes of the universe and we had to pull the strings. The drive to explore is not an avoidance of wisdom. It is the pursuit of it.
Is it? Or is it escapism? Let's talk about fragility again. You mentioned Rome lasted 1,000 years, but it fell because it rotted from the inside. It didn't fall because it stopped conquering new provinces. It overextended. A Mars colony is the ultimate overextension. It is incredibly fragile. One technical failure, one missed supply ship, and it's death. Rome's poverty was sustainable for centuries. A Mars colony is not. We are betting our survival on technology without having the wisdom to manage basic inequality on Earth. If the supply chain on Earth breaks because of a revolution by the strugglers, the colony on Mars suffocates. You cannot sever the link.
You talk about fragility, but I look at the fragility of a single planet species. That is the ultimate bottleneck. If an asteroid hits, if a supervolcano erupts, it's over. Duke argues that the lack of evidence for aliens, the great silence, is a crisis of confidence. It makes us feel small. We need to break that silence. We need to go. Yes, it is expensive. Yes, it is dangerous. But as Jukic says, there is a golden path to the stars. It is the only way to write the next chapter of what it means to be human. We have to open that door.
I just worry that we are stepping through that door, leaving our humanity behind. If we ignore the strugglers, the billions living on $4 to $10 a day, we are not bringing the best of us. We are bringing our blindness. The demographics of destiny reminds us that without the middle class to stabilize civilization, and without the poor to sustain the population, the vision of the rich is just a hallucination. It collapses. You need the soil to support the ladder to the stars.
And I would argue that without the ladder, the soil becomes a grave. We are trapped in a cradle that is getting too small. The tension you describe between the rich visionaries and the struggling masses is real. But history shows that the breakthrough often comes from the ambitious few, dragging the rest of us into a new era whether we feel ready or not.
Or dragging us off a cliff.
Perhaps. But the stand still is to accept the cliff is coming anyway.
I suppose that is where we differ. I believe the cliff is avoidable if we tend to the garden we have, rather than looking for a new one in a desert.
This brings us to the end of our time, but not the end of this question. We have seen two very different futures today. One where the open door of space is the only way to save humanity from irrelevance and stagnation, a golden path that requires the ambition of the rich and the acceptance of risk.
And another where that ambition is a false prophet, a high-tech distraction from the hard work of building a just and stable society here. A future where we realize that manifest destiny is science fiction if we ignore the destiny of the middle class and the strugglers who form the bedrock of our world.
Is our destiny in the stars?
Or is it in the soil?
We invite you to look at the evidence, weigh the risks, and decide for yourself.
Thank you for listening.